Hello everyone, and welcome back to the final Wednesday edition of The Road to 2000. As always, my name is Caleb Denby, and you heard me right! Final Wednesday edition. We are moving not very far, just over to Tuesday nights at 6:30 Central Time, rather than Wednesday nights at 6 p.m. Central Time. So next week, if you show up here at 6 p.m., you'll still be in for a treat because Doris's class is moving to Wednesday nights at 6 p.m. We're doing a big switcheroo. So still tune in on Wednesday nights, just not for me, for Dorsa. And on Tuesday, I want to see you there as well. All right, with all that aside, what's the topic for tonight? Well, of course, for the final Wednesday edition of The Road to 2000, I wanted to do a special one. And so I'm going to show you a few of my candidates for the best chess games of all time. There's some really famous ones in here, and some games that probably didn't make a lot of people's lists, but they made my list because I find them entertaining, I find them enjoyable, and I find them to be really great games of chess. Without further ado, let's jump into what is a classic of the F3 Nimzo. I am talking about a game between Viswanathan and Magnus Carlsen back in their World Championship match. And now that I say this is one of my favorite games of all time, and I don't even remember which match it was from. The one that, yeah, I don't know. Anyways, the one that Magnus stole the title from, or the one where Vishy challenged again. But, the first one, perfect. So this game, pivotal to Magnus' success. All right, we have d4 by Vishy, knight f6 by Magnus, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4, and then here's a surprise. It's a game in the F3 Nimzo. Of course, I had to include an F3 Nimzo game on my list. I would have preferred if it was a game where white was able to crush and dominate, but instead we have this really interesting game by Magnus here. Magnus adopts one of the more combative plans that goes immediately for counterplay on the queen side of the board. Rather than sort of continue the fight in the center for too long, Magnus says, I'm going to roll through on the queen side, and your central play, your kingside play, simply isn't going to make a difference. So to do this, first we actually see Magnus play d5, and this move makes a lot of sense intuitively. f3, of course, fights for control of the e4 square, wants to play this pawn out to e4, so black can respond with d5, trying to at least slow this idea down. Now white plays a3, putting the question to this bishop. If it retreats, then white can, on occasion, continue through with e4. So instead, we see bishop takes c3, b takes c3, and now c5. And this is sort of the main line for black in this position. You play d5 to slow down e4, and then you play c5 to apply some pressure to white's dark squares as well. Sort of the thinking here early on is that if black puts a lot of pressure on white's center right away, white will not really find the time to play a quick e4 and sort of come after black in the center quite so quickly. Here, white takes the opportunity to fix the doubled pawns with c takes d5, e takes d5, and then plays e3. Of course, e4 is a little bit too ambitious here because black has effectively, for the moment, stopped this idea. So e3 instead, and now white's plan is quite simple. White wants to play bishop d3, knight e2, knight g3, and with all of these pieces working together, achieve the move e4. Also, kingside castles, bringing your rook to the e-file is quite common, and white just has very easy, very harmonious play. However, Magnus chooses a line here that plays against that standard idea, while at the same time furthers the play on the queen side, and that is with this move of c4. So why is c4 such a big deal? Well, for one, it is a highly committal move by black. Rather than leave the pawn on c5, where black can continue to challenge the dark squares in the center of the board, black fully commits to attacking these light squares, as I've stated before, and tries to keep white from developing in this most natural way, to keep white from developing out with ease and playing e4 all as part of a smooth plan. Sort of throws a wrench in the works. So rather than try to develop this bishop to the worst square of e2, Vishy calmly develops the knight instead, as is the main line theory. And we have knight c6 getting developed as well, and g4 by white. This is how players with the white pieces have chosen to respond against c4, and this makes a lot of sense. The bishop can't come out this way to support e4, so instead it comes out to g2 to support e4. We also leave the g3 square open for the knight, and we're not super worried about weakening our king side, especially after black has just locked down the center and removed any possibilities of opening things like the c file. So center is locked down, and this is pretty much the only natural way to develop now for white. We see kingside castles by black, bishop g2 by white, and then Magnus doesn't waste any time. Black, as I said, is aiming for queenside play here. And this is why I love this game so much. There are certain variations in chess where both sides tend to almost completely ignore each other and go about their own plans on opposite sides of the board. You see this in the King's Indian defense, and you also see this a little bit in this line. And those can make for some really, really exciting games, because you get the sense that whoever breaks through first is going to be the player that wins the game. And it's that tension, that balance in this game that makes it such an interesting one. So, no time to waste in games like these. When you are sort of racing your opponent to enact your plan, you have to be playing very, very quickly. So we see Magnus immediately aiming to cement the knight on b3. Meanwhile, white actually has to catch up on development a little bit. So we see kingside castles, knight b3, rook a2. And this rook a2 move is actually a really important one. So this has actually been a really strange singular move that I have spent a ton of time analyzing. Knight b3, this is a position that you almost always achieve or see in this line of the f3 Nimzo-Indian. The knight lands on b3, attacking the rook, attacking the bishop, and white has a seemingly very simple decision. Do you bring the rook to the half-open file on b1, or do you bring the rook to a2? And try as I have to find a line where white gets a distinct advantage, both moves actually have pretty distinct flaws here, and it's pretty interesting to see the difference. So against rook a2, black can and should continue out with b5, and again, go for this queenside play as quickly as possible. We're going to see Magnus just create a pawn storm on the queen side and try to get these pawns down the board before white has a chance to achieve anything in the center or the king side. But against rook b1, b5 is actually sort of a fatal mistake, and black should play the move a5 instead. And I discussed this in a previous lecture actually, where a5, the important thing to note here is that rook a6 is actually a really important defensive idea, and for that, among other reasons, a5 is a much better move than b5 here. So here we see Vichy play rook a2, and honestly, I prefer the lines with rook b1 with white here, although I'm sure Vichy's team had their reasons and did a lot more work than I did on this one move here, preparing for a world championship, of course. So Magnus continues as normal with the move b5, as we expect, and now white continues with knight to g3. A5 by black is to be expected, and now we see another really important decision point here by white. And I think this, along with the decision to play rook a2, is what leads to such an interesting game here. White is actually at a little bit of a crossroads in this position, although you might not expect it offhand here. So what do I mean when I say white is at a crossroads? Well, you are staring down the move b5, b4 by black. It shouldn't be played immediately due to tactics on the a file, but this is black's idea. Black is going to play b5 to b4, weaken or remove the c3 pawn, and play to promote the c4 pawn. And you'll actually see this plan in the game. We know what black is going to do. And the question with the white pieces is how confident are we in our plan? White's plan, of course, is to break through with e4 and come careening through the center along with the f file, attacking the king, and again, pushing in the center. e4 is sort of the crux of it. And the question you have to ask is, how quickly is my plan coming through versus how quickly is black's plan coming through? And I think here Vichy makes perhaps the wrong decision. He plays the move g5. And this seems like a really nice move to bring the g-pawn to a square where it's not attacked by this bishop and this knight. It also removes the knight from the defense of the e4 square. And it seems like an overall good move. It seems like it's even winning a tempo, right? So it's not wasting any time. However, I do think the pawn sacrifice with e4 would have been perhaps a better option for Vishy here. It looks a little bit dubious to be giving up this pawn, but believe it or not, this is actually going to be the faster way, quote unquote, for white to play with the plans here. If black wants to win this pawn, then black has to capture on e4, giving up this strong d5 pawn that was standing in the way of white's center. And now we'll see that it's actually white who is firmly in control of the plans here. For example, we're already playing e5, and at the cost of a pawn, black has sort of foregone the queenside counterplay in exchange for taking this g-pawn. And white, in the meantime, is breaking through in the center and has a very fun, active game. I think this is what Vishy should have gone for. Instead, Vishy plays the move g5, and I think this is what keeps the game on a pretty level balance, right? Any first move advantage that Vishy had, I think, is gone after the move of g5 because it's simply not breaking through fast enough. We see the move knight to e8, and now the move e4 by Vishy. And the problem now is that black is definitely not forced to take on e4, and in fact, Magnus chooses not to. With e4, though, white is threatening to bring this bishop into the game, and that's why we see knight takes c1, and queen takes c1. And now, a pretty nice move that appears quite often is rook a6. You simply bring the rook to a square where it's defended, by a actually well-placed bishop on c8. This bishop didn't really want to move, so we just moved the rook instead. To protect it on the a file, of course, so that we can prepare b4. And now we're just going to see both players very calmly, very concretely, just enact their plans, right? We've seen Vishy break through in the center. Now it's time to roll down the board and try to checkmate black. And we've seen black prepare the queenside advances, and black is just going to play moves to further this plan as well. And that's what makes this game so great. All the moves are very, very logical, very natural, not too difficult to follow, the reasoning. Yet, somewhere along the way, you see that these players are playing perfect moves, and it all comes back down to these early decisions in the opening, who is actually ending up on top. So let's see how it happens in the game. Vishy plays the move e5, and this is a reasonably committal decision, but it's one to sort of change the game from fighting over the center of the board with threats of e takes d5, for example, after f4, to one where Vishy is playing for checkmate on the king side. In the meantime, Magnus reroutes this knight to c7, and again, we see that perhaps g5 was a waste of time. For example, you can imagine this position with the pawn on g4 and the knight on f6, then e5 would actually be coming with tempo, and white would perhaps rather spend a tempo on something other than g5 in that position. So, knight c7, a favorable rerouting for Magnus, defending the center, defending against e6 breaks, also hinting at a potential knight b5 jump. We see f4 by Vishy, which honestly, why not f4 by Vishy? f4, f5, f6, this is what we want to do. And now Magnus finally does break through with b4. At this point, Vishy captures, we see captures, rook a6, and now knight takes a6, once again supporting the queenside advances. And now f5 by Vishy. And both players now are sort of pot committed, so they have to keep on with the plan. You know, rather than waste any time on the king side of the board, Magnus says, all right, I'm going to play b3, checkmate me if you can. If not, I'm going to push through and win with this b pawn. So Vishy, takes up the challenge here and reroutes the queen to the king side. Notably, g6 and f6 I think are both a little bit premature here, because with f6 this is perhaps the better move, but you do sort of show your hand a bit and allow Magnus to shut things off with g6 right away. You're not really ready to take advantage of the weakness on g7. You need 1, 2, 3, 4 moves to get there, which is kind of a lot in a position where the b2 pawn is so close to the end of the board. So because of that, Vishy preemptively plays the move queen f4, and perhaps now f6 ideas are a little bit more reasonable with one of these moves already being cut out. Now we actually see knight c7 by Magnus Carlsen. The knight served its purpose on a6, recapturing the rook and defending the pawn on b4. So now it returns to support the center and again play against these e6 break ideas. Vishy decides now is the time to play f6, and we see g6 by Magnus Carlsen. And for the moment, while white's center looked very, very intimidating, you get to this position and you say, well, wait a second, why should black be so afraid? We have a very, very strong pawn on b3, and yes, we have some scary looking holes in our king side, but for the moment, black's not checkmated, As much as we would like black to be checkmated, black simply is not. And you can prove this with black's next move. So up to this point, I would say both players' play has been reasonably natural and followed the main plans. And now Magnus Carlsen's next move is I would argue, not the most natural one. It's one you arrive at after you calculate and calculate and calculate and decide, well, I guess this is the only move I can play. So black to move, chat room, I want to turn it over to you. What do you think Magnus Carlsen plays in this position to keep the game going here? What does he play in this position? And the chat's mad that I said Vishy made a mistake. I'm so sad. So knight to e6, as I think a lot of people are hinting at, is perhaps the more natural of the options, right? And knight e6 would be a very good move if not for the fact that it kind of gets checkmated by force. So the problem with knight e6 is that queen h6 still comes on the board, and while for the moment you have solved these problems, after the next turn of bishop h3, you'll find yourself once again wanting more protection on the g7 square. So knight e6 is sort of out. It's just not going to cut it here. So believe it or not, the move is actually knight to e8, and this is where the game takes sort of a crazy turn, if it wasn't crazy enough for you already. With knight e8, Magnus Carlsen is essentially saying, I don't need this rook to win the game, right? I have my knight on e8, it's stopping checkmate, that's good enough for me, I'm putting all my bets on this b3 pawn. And that's something that is sort of hard to believe if you're playing with the black pieces. So I think this move really shows Magnus's ability to number one, calculate out the variations, and number two, his willingness to make ugly looking moves to further the game and perhaps get a good position. And I think Magnus actually saw this coming all the way back from knight a6. You're looking at this position if you're Magnus Carlsen, and you're saying, well, my opponent just played queen f4. The plan is pretty clear. I need to do something about it. And so knight c7, preparing knight e8, why not? And I think that's really something from Magnus Carlsen. Anyways, the game continues. Knight e8. Vishy opts to play queen h6 directly anyways, just keeping up the pressure here, making sure that none of these three pieces can ever really move again. In fact, almost half of black's army is completely immobilized. The knight can't move or it's checkmate in one. The king can't move or it's checkmate in one. These three pawns and this rook all can't legally move. And in fact, these two pawns can't move either. So, black's down to three pieces. Looking kind of tough for the world champion when you're down to three pieces that you're allowed to move. But it just so happens that it was all according to plan. b2 by Magnus is actually the only move to stay in the game. You simply have to be pushing towards b1. And the problems arise for white when you realize that after something like rook to b1, you simply can't compete against this queen. Black may only have three mobile pieces, or in this case, only two mobile pieces, but one of them is a queen. And the queen is going to be really, really powerful here. White is going to have issues defending against the c3 pawn, while at the same time making sure the b2 pawn doesn't become a queen. And so if white had played rook b1, queen a5 would actually just be winning the game in this case. Which is why we see Vishy continue to go all in. Who cares about a stupid b pawn? Remember, white's playing for checkmate, black's playing to promote a pawn. The game doesn't end when you promote a pawn, says Vishy Anand. And that's why Vishy chose the move rook to f4. Vishy says, I don't care about your second queen. I am going to deliver checkmate. Magnus says, okay, I'll make a second queen. And then unfortunately, this is where the game takes a nasty turn. So up to this point, I have been applauding both players play. Vishy and Magnus have both been playing a fantastic game so far, and the fair result to the game likely would have been a draw. I actually do have the engine flipped on and it thinks white's winning, but that's not true. Trust me, I've analyzed this a little bit further. It's just a draw. But it's only a draw if you respond to this check the correct way. So I want to ask the chat room if you can see the nuances here. Why? What piece should we block with and why? Because it's a mistake that Vishy made at the end of a long and arduous game where, you know, it was sort of walking a tightrope the whole way. One mistake by either side, one slow move, and the scale could have tipped. To this point, the scales have stayed balanced, but this is where it all goes wrong. What do you think? Yeah, I only tell you I'm looking at the engine when I know the engine is wrong, to show you just how smart I am. Agad Madar could never. He would look at this engine analysis and say white is winning. Or maybe not. Anyways, the chat room is split. A lot of people say bishop f1, a lot of people say knight f1, one person says kf1, which I would assume is a vote for the knight. And I have great news for the people saying knight f1. You play like Vishy Anand, and he's pretty good. But unfortunately, this is the losing move. And Vishy actually resigns after Magnus Carlsen's next move. So I'll let you guys at home find the winning move for black. Why is knight f1 wrong? What genius idea exists in the position for Magnus Carlsen? Black to move and win here. And yeah, you guys have the right idea. It's sort of an unnatural idea, but when you realize that black has two of these things, you start to get a little bit more free with what you do with this one. And queen to e1 is the only winning move for Magnus. The reason being, you suddenly realize that the h4 square is now defended, and if you follow through on your plan to play rook h4, I'm simply going to capture it. And from here, queen number 2 will enter the fray, and while this rook can't legally move at the moment, it is still on the board, whereas white just does not have one of those guys. And that's going to be enough for Vishy Anand to go on to, or Magnus Carlsen to go on to win the game. And so Vishy simply resigns after queen to e1. But this raises the question, you know, why is the game a draw after bishop f1? Why isn't white just crushing attacked by Vishy Anand? You know, rook h4 is coming, unstoppable. Does the chat room also see why Magnus Carlsen is not losing in this position? Because this is absolutely obscene. This is obscene. And if bishop f1 had been played in the game and the players actually arrived at this level position, honestly, like that would be the game of, you know, forever. Greatest game of all time in my book, if this were played. So Etienne has the correct first move. Queen f5 actually doesn't do anything to stop our idea. Queen f5 looks great, like, you know, you want to sacrifice the queen for pieces, but like honestly, number one, I could take it, but number two, I could also not take it, right? Like you're not exactly defending the checkmate. And so, believe it or not, by process of elimination, the only real thing that black can do here is play queen d1. And what's the idea of queen d1? Well, it's the same idea as queen e1. It's saying, help me, I need to stop the checkmate. Against rook h4, I'm playing queen h5. And like this is really something here. This is probably the most perfect representation of, you know, two plans in chess, both being enacted at the same time, both players you know, being unyielding in their plans, focusing wholeheartedly on their plan, ignoring their opponent, and then the end result ending up equal. So White's plan was effective. White threatened checkmate, and Black had to give up massive amounts of material to stop it. But Black's plan was also effective because Black got another queen. So because both plans were so effective, we get a position that is just equal. So of course knight takes should be played here, but now after g takes, rook takes, very importantly, the g pawn is now gone, and we see bishop f5 by, well, we could have seen bishop f5 by Magnus Carlsen. And this position is far from over. It's still very, very complex. For the moment, Black is up a piece, but likely the continuation we would see, well, the best continuation, I don't know if we would see it, is g6, interfering with the bishop. Of course, you have to take with the bishop to keep this square defended. And then after something like rook g5, it's in Black's interest to just go ahead and sacrifice this back. And now we have some endgame, which should more or less be equal. And yeah, so this game just blows my mind. Both players just totally ignoring their opponent's plan and pushing through to try and enact their own. And then they were both almost successful. And if they both were successful until that very last moment, then we would have seen the game continue on into some kind of endgame here, which would likely be drawn. So I want to open it up to questions on this game. I did go through it. I guess I didn't go through it that fast. It felt like I was speeding through, but there's a lot to talk about. But questions here. Questions here. That's a fishy move. I mean, it's the only move. I have no doubt that Magnus would have found queen d1 because there's simply nothing else. There's simply nothing else against bishop f1 here. Like, you can't stop rook h4 any other way. There's not even any checks. Like, okay, there's one check, but now where are you going to check me from? I don't know. Okay, I guess you check me from here. But now there's no checks. See? What was the opening? This was an f3 Nimzo-Indian. What was the score at this point? I don't know. I don't know. I think Magnus might have already been +1 by this point in the match. All right, well, let us move along to another game that I want to label as one of the greatest of all time. Like the first game, it probably isn't topping most people's lists as far as greatest game ever. You know, it's no Game of the Century by Bobby Fischer. It's no Kasparov Immortal. But what it is the quintessential Petrosian game. So Petrosian is known for many, many things. Perhaps what he is best known for, rightfully so or not, is the exchange sacrifice. And if I had to give this name a title, I would say it's probably the exchange sacrifice immortal here. Tigran, Petrosian, big-time exchange sacrificer. And let's see how he did it against one chess player by the name of Boris Spassky. This is actually another World Championship game. And it's one where Spassky was unsuccessful in stealing the title from Tigran Petrosian. So let's jump into it. We have knight f3, knight f6, g3, g6, and c4, bishop g7. We get a sort of English system here with both players adopting the early fianchetto, and you'll see this sometimes where neither player commits to any of the central pawn moves early on and keeps basically just all of their options open. Black can still go d6, d5, c6, c5. Maybe you can even move the e-pawn, but that does look a little bit fishy. But basically, all of these structures are perfectly playable still for black. Instead, we see castles, still keeping the options open, castles by white, and then knight c6 by black. So a little bit of an unusual approach at this point, I would say. Generally, at this point, you know, black picks one of the choices, right? You have to stake a claim in the center at some point, but Boris says no. He says, I'm going to play knight c6 instead and develop my pieces or something. All right. Petrosian continues out now with knight c3, and perhaps this is the reason why knight c6 is a little bit less common. Now, white is able to effectively control the d5 square, and a move like d5 might be a little bit harder to manufacture in the near future. Although, black could still for the moment play it. Instead, we see Spassky taking a dark square approach with d6. And at this point, there usually does come a time in every like high-level Grandmaster game where if your opponent isn't taking the center, somebody says enough is enough, and they play a move like d4. They say, okay, all right, if you're not going to put any pawns up here, I'll put all of my pawns up here and make you live to regret it. At this point, though, we are still in pretty well-treaded territory, and Spassky just plays a6. And this move happens for a number of reasons. Basically, it is important to control b5 in this opening because white is sort of threatening to attack down these long light squares. Okay, continuing on, we actually have d5 by Petrosian, making a further claim in the center as black still has not been able to contest any square other than e5 and c5. Now we see knight a5 by Spassky. And the continuation now is knight d2, defending against the c4 pawn threat. And finally, we see c5 by Spassky. So what we have here is a pretty classic case of white taking a little bit of extra space in the center, and black in exchange playing for a super powerful dark squared bishop. And this shows up in a number of 1d4 openings, and we kind of transposed to a d4 opening when Petrosian did play d4. Now, what's sort of unique about this one, and good news for white, is that number one, this knight is a little bit sidelined on a5. There are some arguments whether this is a good thing because it applies some pressure, or a bad thing because it's sidelined on a5, but generally this is not really where you want your knight to be. And aside from that, white has not actually committed to the move of e4, and this is going to allow white a little bit of extra leeway, a little bit more flexibility in how Petrosian chooses to play. So here we see queen c2, once again keeping this flexibility. I don't think it really makes sense to play a move like e4 outright. Again, this does take away a lot of your flexibility, right? You're cutting off this bishop, and you're also, for one, cutting off this diagonal, and number two, you're making f4 a lot harder to play for yourself. For example, if e5 were to be played, suddenly something like f4 is going to be a little bit more difficult to manufacture without this e-pawn to support your position a little bit more. So queen c2 by Petrosian, and now e5 by Spassky. Pretty standard stuff. Just taking a firmer control in the center, and perhaps even looking to expand further with something like f5 in the near future. We see b3 by Petrosian, still keeping it calm and just preparing to finish development. Knight g4 now by Spassky, once again keeping in line with the plan of playing f5, and this is the moment when Petrosian decides it is in fact time to play e4. The main reason being black is pretty much committed to this plan of playing f5 after the move e5 has been played, and so Petrosian is simply looking to contest this idea with the e-pawn. And we see just that happen. f5 by Spassky, e takes f5, g takes f5, and now knight back to d1 is the move for Petrosian. So we have a little bit of a reversal in a sense, where black is now trying to run down the center in the e file and also the f file with the f pawn, and white's pieces seem to be lacking a little bit in space. Once again though, the saving grace here for white is really always going to be that this knight on a5 looks like such a bad piece, right? Petrosian has played b3 to shore up the structure, also to give the bishop the b2 square, but also just really pointing out how useless this knight is. And so any attack by black is sort of coming with this caveat where this knight is never really going to participate. And we'll see how that influences the game a little bit later. We have the move b5 now by Spassky, and perhaps this is an attempt to make this knight relevant once again, applying some more pressure to c4. And now I would like to pause for the first time in a while again and ask you guys, how would you like to continue with the white pieces in this case? How should Petrosian continue the game? Because from my perspective, I think white's position does look a little bit scary, right? Sure, this knight is bad. Everybody agrees this knight's the worst piece ever. There was some contention about it a few moves ago, but now that white's structure is so solid, this knight just doesn't look good. But how do we contend against these pawns rolling down the board? How should we contend? What do we think? So there's a few ideas in the chat. Bishop b2 has been suggested, f3, h3, and these are all pretty reasonable ideas. The point to realize is that there's one square in particular that is absolutely critical for white to control in these positions. Does anybody know what square is super, super critical for white to keep control of? And of course, that square is the e4 square. Basically, whenever you play the move e takes f5 in any of these structures, the e4 square becomes, incredibly important. If white loses control of this square, loses the opportunity to put his pieces on this square, then black is almost certainly better. So if you play a move like rook b1, for example, just a super slow move, black is definitely going to play the move e4, and you may seriously regret not challenging this square a little bit earlier. For example, let's just continue playing a bit slowly with knight e3, and now let's say knight e5. And you suddenly start to realize that controlling the e4 square can be pretty pivotal, because if black is able to comfortably play the move e4, then the e5 square opens up to black, and meanwhile, all of these squares sort of disappear from white's camp. You can no longer really use any of these squares to your advantage. So, for those reasons, the idea of f3 should be a very, very important one. Petrosian opted to play it immediately, but actually, something like bishop b2 is still perfectly fine, with the idea that e4 is going to be met by a very favorable trade, and then f3 anyways. So, f3 in the game is an excellent move by Petrosian, and it's an important idea to remember. You basically just always need to be sure you are the one in control of the e4 square. So Petrosian does it directly. You can also sort of delay doing it. It's not like a super critical move, like you don't lose if you don't play f3 in this position, but it is a very, very critical idea to know. So f3, removing this knight from its active post, making use of this knight on d1 for the moment, and stopping black from breaking through with e4 and knight e5. So good stuff. So now the question for Spassky is, what are you going to do about it, right? Are you going to just come back and play knight f6, allow white to still stay rather comfortable with something like bishop b2? Because if you do choose this slower approach, you might find yourself facing some weaknesses in the center, right? These pawns look strong, they look powerful, so far advanced, but eventually, let's say white gets a few free moves just to improve the pieces, you're going to be dealing with something along the lines of an f4 break, right? This is something that white can still do to very much challenge the center. In fact, let's do it with the knight on d1. And the point now is that if you try to do the move e4, it's under very, very different circumstances in this case. Number one, you don't have control of the e5 square. Number two, white is successfully challenging this diagonal. And number three, you're now sort of dealing with permanent weaknesses here. These are not so much strengths as they are targets for white to challenge. So, because of those reasons, Spassky actually chooses to play e4 directly here, realizing that bringing this knight to e5 is a critical part of the plan, and retreating it back to f6 is simply going to, lead to a long struggle that is going to favor white. With the more fluid structure and more weaknesses to attack, white should be a bit better if the position goes the slow way. So e4, and seemingly this is a good tactic. It attacks a rook on a1. If you take the knight on g4, I simply take the rook, and then I have more rooks than you. So, question chat room, is this the exchange sacrifice that Petrosian had in mind? Was Petrosian planning to sacrifice the rook on a1 all along? Is this it? Is this the immortal exchange sacrifice, chat? So, of course, this is a trick question. This is not the immortal exchange sacrifice. It's important to realize the difference between a good sacrifice and a bad one. So here, why are we not giving up a rook for a minor piece? Our name is Tigran, Vardanovich, Petrosian. Why are we not giving up the rook for the minor piece? Well, the reason is you just simply don't get enough, right? You don't get enough. There's g takes f5, and it looks like you're getting a lot of compensation, but after check and takes, you start to realize that things are heading towards a simplification here. And you definitely don't want things to be super, super simple when you just have fewer rooks than your opponent. So important to realize that if you're going to sacrifice the exchange, you have to you have to have something for it. I guess that's sort of Captain Obvious over here, but still. Bishop b2 is the move instead for Tigran, continuing to contest this diagonal and not yet ready to give up this rook on a1. We see e takes f3 now by Spassky, and while it's true that white has in a sense succeeded in giving black a weakness here, black has also succeeded in leaving the e5 square open for this knight. So really, I think black is doing a bit better off here than he was in the other line we were looking at. We see bishop takes f3 now by Tigran. We get bishop takes b2, and queen takes b2, knight e5. So, black got the knight to e5. That's pretty good. However, as I stated before, this pawn is a bit weak. So let's see Spassky's solution to that. Right? So far, Tigran and Spassky have been playing a very complicated game, where they were playing with pretty good accuracy. They made some difficult decisions in there. Like Spassky's e4 is a difficult decision to make. Knight f6 looks like a tempting option to just keep the game in normalcy. Meanwhile, Petrosian has been doing great to keep things sort of flexible and to pose difficult questions to Spassky. And at this point, once again, Spassky has another difficult question. What are you going to do with this pawn on f5? So, chat room, what do you think? What are we going to do with the pawn on f5? Nothing? Something? Are we going to do something else? So yeah, everybody wants to push. And I have good news for you. You're playing like Boris Spassky. I also have bad news. It's not a good move. It's just not that good of a move, it turns out. And then it turns out there are better moves. But that's okay. That's okay. So I think it's fair to say here that white has some advantage in this position. And the reason being, white has a very, very distinct target, and in fact is even creating some threats, although perhaps not immediate, on the other side of the board. Beyond that, there is a very nice rerouting plan for white in the position. Knight e3 to g2 to f4 looks quite powerful. It does look like a really good idea for white to sort of enact this plan here. However, that's not to say that black is without ideas as well. So I think perhaps a better way forward for black would have been to simply play something like queen f6, a move which for the moment is effectively stopping the idea of knight e3, and just play it a little bit more slowly. You can play bishop d7, get your other rook in the game, and just play for activity down the center of the board. While I do think white has some advantage here, I do think this is better than the immediate pawn sacrifice, although this one does look a bit more fun. So in the game, we see g takes f4 by Petrosian, and here Spassky actually misses another chance to perhaps equalize the game. Perhaps white is still going to be a little bit better, because this knight on a5 is always bad, but there is actually a tactic here that would be pretty nice for black, and that is simply rook takes f4. After rook takes f4, we have rook takes f4 by white, of course, and then queen to g5 check. Just forking king and rook. King h1, queen takes on f4, and then after knight c3, again, it's a little bit unclear how bad things really are for black with this knight stuck on a5, but at least we've gotten rid of the weak pawn, and we can activate our other pieces while this knight will stay a little bit trapped on this side of the board. So instead of this, black plays bishop to h3. So what do you guys think after bishop to h3? White to move here. How to continue? How to continue? There's a question of why didn't Petrosian take with the knight instead of the queen on b2? I think the queen is actually quite active on b2, and then perhaps I might have helped answer the question a little bit. The knight actually has a really nice rerouting plan in a lot of these structures. And the knight coming to e3 is quite nice. All right, and the chat room is wise to the tricks here. So bishop h3, of course, is making a threat, but it's not a very strong threat, especially against Petrosian. Petrosian says, hey, you know what, this rook on f1, it's fine, but really, this rook on a1 is not participating in the game. And so that is basically the essence of the exchange sacrifice. It's not about the material count of the pieces. It's not about if your piece is technically worth 5 and the enemy's is technically worth 3. It's about the purpose that those pieces serve in the position. In this current position, this rook on a1 does not serve a purpose. It's not helping. It's defending an a2 pawn and can shuffle a couple squares along the back rank, right? Not a very useful piece. Meanwhile, this bishop is controlling large swaths of the board. So if we can trade this bishop for this rook, it's not really that bad of a trade. And this is the thinking that leads Petrosian to play the move knight to e3. Yes, bishop takes f1 is winning in exchange, quote unquote, but you're not really winning the rook on f1. You're sort of winning the rook on a1, because now this rook launches into the game to f1, is serving a very, very useful purpose, and suddenly this pawn is everything Petrosian needs to win the game. The f pawn right here is an absolute monster, taking away the outpost that Spassky had worked so hard to carve out for himself. So after this, we see knight g6 by Spassky. Now bishop out to g4, and once again, the bishop for black is now sorely missed, right? These large swaths of the board that were once controlled by the bishop are now in Petrosian's hands. And all for what? All for a rook on a1, right? It's perfect. Perfect. However, there's a problem. Black is winning a pawn. So, white to move after knight takes f4, chat room. What do you think? Yeah, and the chat room is also sort of pointing out this rook on a8 is not doing a great deal either, although it can potentially come into the game, right? It's not stuck forever. And yeah, of course, the correct move here is to capture on f4. Like, what do you think this is? What do you think this is? Against Tigran, Vardanovich, Petrosian, you're gonna allow him to play rook takes f4? All right. So rook takes f4 is simply winning the game, and it is sort of poetic justice that, hey, this rook's purpose was to support the pawn on f4. If black's going to take the pawn anyways, then your rook is pointless. What's the point of the rook? It was supposed to defend the pawn. And so defend the pawn it does. And rook takes f4 played in the game. We see rook takes f4 by Spassky. And now the obvious problems sort of arise after bishop e6 check. Turns out that knight was pretty important to stop bishop e6. And now with bishop e6 on the board, white is simply crushing. If you were to go king f8, simply queen h8 check, king e7, take this guy with check, and there's absolutely no escaping to the queen side for black here. For example, king f8. In any number of moves, but perhaps simplest is queen h6 with a fork. King e8 as well, and things are going to go down a similar path here. Things are going to go down a similar path where the rook is going to hang and black is busted. So rather than king f8, we do see the move rook f7 in the game, but now white's minor pieces are able to invade. Knight e4 comes onto the board, and this is a sad, sad story overall. Queen h4 is what Spassky tried, going for some counterplay over here. If the knights move, you get some checks in the position, but Petrosian is not afraid. Simply knight takes d6, queen g5 check, king h1, and there's simply no time to take on e3, because once again, bishop takes f7 is going to be good enough to win the game. This time, there is a problem with black's king and queen royalty pieces here. For example, now white would be taking the pawn. Okay, so king h1 played in the game, and Spassky tries rook a7 to just hold on to the f7 square, and now the pieces just continue to flood. We have bishop takes f7, rook takes f7, and who sees the last move of the game? The final move of the game, everybody. Who sees it? Who sees it? White to move. And yeah, of course, queen h8 is the winning move here. Simply drawing the king to the h8 square with the fork, and then suddenly this knight on a5 is finding itself outmatched by White's army. To his credit, though, the knight on a5 remained fairly safe throughout the game. This knight was never really in danger of dying. It also, however, was never really in danger of playing. And that's sort of what allowed Petrosian all this freedom to go crazy and sacrifice all the exchanges, I think, in my opinion at least. So that is this game, the exchange sacrifice immortal, we'll call it, where Petrosian just gives up all the rooks and easily defeats Spassky. Now, while the exchange sacrifices are pretty and nice to look at, I think the really interesting battle here happens in these couple moves, where we see like knight d1, this b5 move by black, and then f3, right? f3, e4. We see this fight going on in the center, and then because Petrosian sort of got the better end of this fight, we saw the pressure was really put on Spassky to come up with some interesting ideas. Those interesting ideas are what led to the exchange sacrifices that makes this game so awesome. So really cool game in my opinion. I'll open it up again to the chat room though for any questions here on this game. Yeah, and the fitting metaphor, the knight on a5 is the Little League outfielder put so far away from the infield so as to never have to touch the ball. Tough. Tough truths. Why did black never break the pawn chain? Not worth it. So this tension here between the b pawn and the c pawn never really broke throughout the entire game. And the reason is it doesn't really change the position all that much. Like sort of at any moment here, if you include b takes c4 and b takes c4, like nothing has really changed. The only thing that might change is if white decides that there's something better to do than recapture, and for example play a move like knight e3, when black might be left hanging a little bit as far as, you know, what was the point of taking on c4, right? Like if the pawn's ever hanging, then you can take. Until then, white's never really going to take and open the a file for you. That would just be a pretty serious mistake. How likely is it to get a game this sharp at an over-the-board tournament with, you know, normal chess players? Well, I am willing to say that the craziest games of chess I've ever seen were not played by world champions. They were played by toddlers. So really anything can happen, honestly. Anything can happen. It just doesn't mean, you know, the craziness won't necessarily be correct chess, but that's the way it goes. All right, we have time for another quick one. So I'm going to scroll through very quickly one of my all-time favorite games, which of course is the game I referenced to sound smart in relation to every other position. I'm talking about Botvinnik Capablanca in AVRO 1938. So let's jump into it here. All-time classic F3 Nimzo-Indian game, except not really the F3 Nimzo, but kind of the F3 Nimzo, so you'll see what I mean. So we start with the Nimzo-Indian with bishop b4, and we actually start with the e3 Nimzo-Indian, but there's some well-known tricky transpositions here where you're going to eventually go for the f3 plans, and that's exactly what happens in the game. Black chooses d5, we get a3, takes, c5 now, takes on d5, takes on d5, bishop d3, castles, knight e2, and similar to that game we talked about between Viswanathan and Magnus Carlsen, in this case, the bishop has actually arrived at the d3 square. So black not in time to play the c4 plan that Magnus chose, instead has to contend with this bishop, and that's why we see b6 in the game. Black simply opts to trade this bishop off because it is such a good and supporting piece on d3. And we see bishop a6, knight a6, and now bishop b2 by Botvinnik. And this is a little bit of a strange one, bishop b2. It doesn't really look that natural to be putting your bishop on a diagonal behind these pawns, but, you know, longtime watchers of my classes will know that this is a pretty common theme in the f3 Nimzo. We want to push this pawn to e4, and the danger of doing that is weakening your control of the d4 pawn. So here, Botvinnik puts this bishop here a little bit earlier on than we would normally see, but the idea is pretty sound. It's just to support this d4 pawn from behind. queen d7 is the follow-up, and now we see a pretty interesting move that is a little bit less common for the f3 Nimzo. It's the move a4. And this shows a great deal of understanding by Botvinnik. So where the Vishy Anand Magnus Carlsen game was a game of ignoring the opponent's plan and sort of just continuing as quickly as possible on the opposite side of the board, Botvinnik shows that occasionally a move like a4 can be thrown into the mix, a move that really slows down the opponent's plan, right? a4 does nothing to further white's ideas in the center, but it does a lot to slow down black's ideas on the queen side. So something to look out for. You know, sometimes the best way to play isn't necessarily to totally ignore your opponent, although that can be the most fun. Now we see rook f to e8 by Capablanca, just pressuring down the center, and queen d3 by Botvinnik, challenging the knight on a6 and supporting the pawn on e3. We get c4, queen back to c2 now, knight b8, and rook a to e1. So again, white really just preparing for this f3 e4 idea, which is why I like to claim this game as sort of an f3 Nimzo, despite it being move 16 and f3 is not on the board. Okay, so knight out to c6 now is the idea for Capablanca. The knight on a6 was bad, so he's looking to improve it. And now we see knight g3. And now I'm going to prove to you why the f3 Nimzo is better than this hybrid version where you wait forever to play f3. And the reason for that is black's potential move in this position. So black to move and potentially equalize here, a little bit unexpectedly, potentially equalize. Let me know what you think, chat. So yeah, Chess King actually has the right idea here. So much like a4 is a really good move at stifling black's queenside play, black has a good move to sort of stifle white's plan of f3 and e4. And that move is knight to e4 here. This is a pretty awkward move to meet. Basically, there's just no good way to deal with this, right? We would love to still play f3, but this pawn structure just isn't going to be ideal, right? We're looking to play e4, like let's say, you know, black passes, we play e4. But after something like this, it's true we get a super strong center, but we also get a super weak king side. So it's going to cause white a lot of problems to continue through with the normal plan if we do deal with these doubled g-pawns. And meanwhile, you can take on e4, but at this point, it's going to be a sort of wildly different structure, and it's going to be a lot harder to prove that this bishop belongs here on b2. Just going to be harder in general to activate this bishop. For example, after f3, white is effectively blockading all the light squares with the move like queen d5. I don't think white can really claim any advantage here. So that's why you should play f3 and move 4 to stop knight e4 on move 17, clearly. Instead, though, Capablanca kept going with the one-track mind approach with knight a5, knight b3, as we saw in the Magnus Carlsen game. Now, of course, though, Botvinnik is seizing the opportunity to play the move f3. We see knight b3 by Capablanca, but this is a case of the plans being a little bit misevaluated. So in the Anand Carlsen game, both players accurately evaluated the plans to be good enough to deal with the other side's ideas. In this case, Capablanca's queenside play is winning the a-pawn, whereas Magnus Carlsen's queenside play was promoting to a queen, right? And there's a little bit of a difference between those plans, right? You win the a-pawn to try and win the endgame, where you have an extra pawn on the queen side, right? You make a queen to try to win the game, right? So Capablanca trying to win the a-pawn, get a winning position if white's plan doesn't succeed. And now that's a big if, whereas Magnus Carlsen's plan was to basically create so many threats on the queen side with a queen that white has no choice but to deal with it. And in this case, Botvinnik definitely can just ignore the fact that the a-pawn is hanging, and that's exactly what happens in the game. We see e4 by Botvinnik breaking in the center. Capablanca collects the dusty a-pawn over there, and which, you know, this pawn has already served its purpose. It slowed down black's queenside play and actually forced itself to be captured at the cost of multiple tempi. So now the question is, how do we continue with Botvinnik? And Botvinnik answers this question with e5, just breaking through in the center. And then, in the interest of time, let's fast forward a bit, because Botvinnik is really just going to roll through the position now and attack the black king, much like we saw Vichy do in the other game. G6, played by Capablanca, f4, and then Capablanca finds the basically only idea to try to stay in the game. If you allow white to play something like f5, f6, you get the horror scenarios that almost appeared in the Vichy Magnus game. So instead, Capablanca plays f5 himself, trying to keep things at bay. However, this just isn't good enough. We see Botvinnik, of course, ripping things open on this side of the board with e takes f6, knight f6, f5, rook e1, rook e1, rook e8, and then the winning move here for Botvinnik is not entirely obvious. Rather than, you know, do something like fg6, allow black to trade, Botvinnik actually brings this pawn in as an attacking piece with the move rook e6. Of course, black wants to trade to not get checkmated, but now this pawn is actually a really critical attacker in the position. King g7, played by Capablanca, and now Botvinnik wriggles in with the queen. We see queen f4, queen e5, queen e7, and then the famous move of the game. So if you guys at home would like to find the winning idea here for Botvinnik, I would encourage you to pause the video now, take a few moments, see if you can find the idea. If not, here it is. Okay, ready everybody? Of course, the winning idea is bishop a3. So much like the a4 pawn served its purpose in diverting the pieces away, making black waste time, the bishop now faces a similar fate. Bishop a3 finally activating along the long diagonal, forcing itself to be captured and drawing the queen away from the defense of the king. And now, with only a queen, a pawn, and knight left, and soon to be just a queen and a pawn, Botvinnik is able to come up with some winning tactics. We see knight h5 check, forking king and knight, forcing itself to be captured. Now queen g5, and queen takes f6. If the king goes this way, it's checkmate in 2, so the king goes to g8. And now simply e7 is checkmating or promoting by force. Of course, we all saw that all these checks are going to end after queen d3, king h4, queen e4, picking up the h-pawn before we get checkmated, pretty important. Queen e2, king h4, queen a4, g4, queen e1, king h5. And then there's no more checks. Okay, we all saw that coming. We all saw that. I don't need to tell you about king h5, no more checks, because I'm sure the chat room definitely saw that coming. And now, of course, simply no way to prevent queen f8 checkmate or, you know, winning massive amounts of material. And so this is probably one of my favorite games with the f3 Nimzo plan, because it goes to show just how pitiful black's queenside play can actually look if black makes some slight mistakes in the opening, as we saw Capablanca do here. And it also goes to show how impressive Magnus Carlsen's game is against Anand. The tightrope you have to walk with the black pieces is quite a thin one in these kinds of positions, and Magnus managed to do it against Vichy. Capablanca in this tournament in 1938, unable to do it against Botvinnik. With all that in mind, I want to thank you guys very much for watching. Thank you for sticking it out with me on all of these Wednesday nights. Again, I will still be around doing the road to 2000. It's just that we're going to go to Tuesday nights, and all these changes and more are visible up on our website, stlouischessclub.org. I think all that information should be up to date now on the new class schedule. It's not that different. Basically, Doris and I are just trading days. I'm going to be on Tuesdays now, and Doris is going to be on Wednesdays. All right, thank you all so much for watching. If you're watching live, please stick around for the endgame class. If not, thank you so much for watching. As always, my name is Caleb Denby, and I will see you next time.